step out a little bit because I was saying to Ryan this morning that I had a few thoughts in my mind, which is a dangerous game, particularly when I like to have a good number of months to polish my thoughts until they're almost invisible. So I'm going to attempt to just share a few things that the Lord's given me over the last few weeks, as we and my family and wider family have kind of gone through quite some difficulties and trials, and hopefully just short, so somebody can kind of fill in the gaps afterwards or take us in a different direction. But I wanted just to look at the passage or passages where Jesus walks on the water, and I'm going to attempt. So it's in three Gospels. It's in Matthew, Mark, and John, and it's ever so slightly different in all three. And I'm going to try and read it from all three as one account, because there's a few bits in it that are really quite good. So I'll start, if I can, in Matthew, and then we'll see how it goes. It might be very clunky. Anyway, so just a bit of context that Jesus has just fed the 5,000 people. So he's just done this miracle. And it says, just after he's done this, so in Matthew 14, verse 22, it says, immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side while he dismissed the crowds. And after he dismissed the crowds, he went up onto the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. But the boat by this time was a long way from land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. Quickly flip into Mark's version in chapter 6, and verse 40, starting at 47. And when evening had come, the boat was out on the sea, and he was alone on the land, this is Jesus, and he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. And about the fourth watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea, and he meant to pass them by. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke to them and said, "Take heart, it's I, do not be afraid." Back into Matthew 14. And Peter, this is verse 28, and Peter answered him, "Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and began to sink. And he cried out, "Lord, save me." Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" And when they got back into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." And quickly into John chapter 6, verse 21, it says, "Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going." That's kind of a clunky version of the account from all three Gospels. But the thing that the Lord has encouraged me with over the past few weeks around these passages is that, so Jesus has just fed the 5,000. He's just done this miracle, and then he kind of gives his disciples this command to get into a boat and to go to the other side. And while they're doing that, he goes up onto a mountain to pray. And he's having kind of fellowship with his Father. This mountain, you could almost say, is a holy mountain. He's there with his Father. This is the place where Jesus was drawing all his strength from his relationship with his Father. It was almost a perfect place after this day of just being spent in giving himself to all these people and doing this wonderful miracle and all the hustle and bustle. He goes onto the mountain by himself to pray and to spend time with his Father and to draw strength and to encourage himself. And yet while he's kind of in that place, it's kind of a perfect place of relationship with his Father, it says that he looks and he sees his disciples in the boat struggling. And I just thought, isn't that a lovely picture? Here's Jesus in this perfect place with his Father, and he looks and sees his disciples struggling to achieve his command. So he's told them to get into the boat and go to the other side. And they're trying their very best to do what he's asked them to do. And they're struggling. And it says that they were making painful headway because the wind was against them and the waves were against them and everything seemingly was against them because they're in the middle of this storm. And you kind of get the sense that Jesus, as he sees his people that he loves struggling, he sees them, they can't sail, can they, because of the waves and the wind. So they're probably rowing. They're probably trying their best. It talks about it being in the evening. One account says they were only a few miles from the land. So they've been rowing for a long time. And at the very best, they're about halfway across the sea. They must have been exhausted. It said that Jesus came to them in the third watch of the night, which I think is around 3 a.m. So this journey has taken a long time and they're getting absolutely nowhere. The people that he loves, trying to achieve what he's told them to do, and they're exhausted. And you kind of get this sense that Jesus sees them, these people struggling, and he doesn't stay on his holy mountain in this perfect place of kind of fellowship with his Father. He comes down the mountain. He sees his people in trouble. He sees the exhaustion. He sees that it's painful. They're making painful headway. And Jesus he leaves this perfect place and he comes down the mountain. And I just thought, what a lovely picture that is. Our Lord, he sees everything that we go through. He sees us in all our struggles, even when those struggles are trying to achieve what he's asked us to do. Go to the other side. That's where I want you to go. That's the destination. And as we try, as we struggle, and as we row as hard as we can, he sees us in that, and he comes down this mountain. What an amazing Saviour. He comes down, but he doesn't just come down the mountain. He goes into the storm to reach his people that are struggling. And I think probably my imagination is ruined by Hollywood and movies, but you can almost see, picture this Jesus, just having this perfect time with his Father and then looking out onto the sea and seeing his people struggling. And he just, no, I'm coming down my mountain and I'm coming into the storm to get my people and to help them. It's a wonderful picture of God's heart, isn't it, in coming into this world. We're not just coming into this world, but coming into our circumstances and our difficulties, and whether that's, external circumstances or storms that are going on inside us. And so he comes down his mountain and he comes into the storm and he walks on the water. And it's a really interesting verse in Mark's account, which I don't totally understand, where it says that he intended to pass them by. And you kind of get this idea that Jesus was showing his disciples that he was in complete authority over everything, over the wind, over the waves, over the storm. This storm was causing them all sorts of pain and difficulty. But for Jesus, he was in complete authority over it. None of it touched him. None of it was going to make him sink. He was walking over it. And it was almost like he was going to pass them by because he wanted to show them that this is who he was. He was showing them that he was the Lord, as we've heard this morning, that he had complete authority over the wind and the waves, that he was unaffected by it. He wasn't going to sink by it. And his intention was initially just to pass them by. And you there's a slight echo in that phrase that kind of links to the account where, the Lord passed Moses by and he hid Moses in the kind of gap in the rock because Moses couldn't see God's face, it said. If he'd seen his face, he would have just died. God was so holy and so different and pure that if Moses had seen his face, he would have died. And so God kind of hides him in the cleft of the rock and passes him by and allows Moses to see his back. And yet, in this account, Jesus intends to pass by, but when he hears the cry of his people, terrified by the situation, by what they're seeing, and they cry out to him, he doesn't hide their eyes and just carry on going, because if they look at him, that's it, it's all over. Jesus instead, he kind of turns to them and says, don't worry, take heart, it's me, I'm here, I'm in the storm with you. You can see me. This is the invisible God made visible, isn't it? Jesus is the kind of the untouchable God made touchable. It's no longer kind of to look on him and we'll die. He came down the holy mountain and came into the storm. And when his people cry out, we can see he doesn't just kind of pass us by. He turns and says, don't worry, I'm here. I'm in this with you and I'm for you. And I'm in complete authority over everything that's going on. These waves, they can't take me down. The wind, it can't throw me off course. I am untouchable by these things. He was showing them that he was in complete authority. The other thing that verse kind of made me think was perhaps, Jesus was more than just a great example for us, wasn't he? He came from heaven and he lived this perfect life. He wasn't, throughout the Gospels we read that, when people were unclean, if they were to touch somebody, they would make that person unclean. But if somebody was unclean and they touched Jesus, they didn't make him unclean. He made them clean. He wasn't going to be affected and kind of taken down by the mess and the sin in this world. He was in authority. It's almost that he needed to be more than just a good example for us. Yeah? Because I kind of get the sense that Jesus, as he lived as a man, we know he was God, fully God. And yet he lived his life on this earth as a man, kind of using the same resources and tools that we have available to us to live. He lived by faith, with a relationship with his Father. But you kind of get a sense of the down-to-earthness of God in this account, that actually I think he knew that I needed more than just to see Jesus living a perfect life and being able to do that using everything that he's given me to use, to live the life he's called me to live. I didn't need a perfect example. I needed a saviour. I needed someone to come in because I couldn't follow him in that way. I needed Jesus to come into my life and save me. And so you get this kind of sense that he, as he was intending to pass them by, when they cry out, he recognises I need to do more than just show them that I'm in authority here. And I need to do more than just show them that I can walk over the waves. And if they really believe that they can do the same, actually, I'm going to turn to them and I'm going to say, don't worry, I'm here. I'm in this storm with you. I've come down and I've come into the storm, everything that's going on, and I'm in authority and I'm here. Take heart, be of good cheer. I'm here with you. I think it's a really nice picture. And then you just get this little kind of interlude, this kind of this bit with Peter. Which I think is really quite interesting. And I've kind of changed a few times on how I've seen this verse. So I'm just going to share kind of what was in my head this morning, really. It's dangerous, isn't it? But so Peter sits, so they see Jesus, and he says, take heart, don't be afraid, it's me. And Peter says to him, Lord, if it's you, command me to come to you on the water. And Jesus says, come. So Peter got out of the boat, and he walked on the water to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid and he began to sink and he cried out, Lord, save me. And immediately Jesus reached out his hand and took hold of him. And I suppose I've always kind of seen this passage as being really, it's amazing, isn't it, that Jesus not only was able to walk across the water, but he was able to enable a normal man to do the same. Peter was able to get out of the boat and start walking over the waves. And it was almost, you get the sense, as long as Peter kept his eyes fixed on Jesus and didn't take his eyes off Jesus, he could have carried on going towards the Lord. And I've always thought, isn't that amazing that that's what God can do for us if we fix our eyes? And it's kind of a message of, fix your eyes on Jesus and kind of block out the wind and the waves going on around you. But I suppose just in recent weeks, I've realised just how difficult that is to do. And I think the Lord knows. And I think kind of that's part of the reason why Peter doesn't manage that in this passage, why it's all written like this, because I think you kind of get the sense that in Peter there is still an element of self-determination, self-will, because it's interesting that he's the one that initiated this event. He says, Lord, if it's you, tell me to come. Jesus didn't initiate it by saying, look, it's me, come out to me on the water. There's something perhaps going on in Peter. And we know that Peter's character was quite strong, don't we? And he was strong, self-willed man. And it's almost, you get the sense that as he's walking towards Jesus, he's just got this ability to block everything else out the wind and the waves, block out the kind of the mentalness, the situation that he's in. I'm going to keep my eyes fixed on Jesus. There's an element there, as wonderful as it is, of what he's doing, that I'm just going to keep my eyes fixed on Jesus. And I get the impression, or have got the impression in previous weeks, that perhaps that, as amazing as that account is, and we love that account, don't we? Because I think probably that's what we all want to be doing, walking on the water. It's amazing. It's kind of miraculous. And yet there's still a distance between Peter and Jesus. And this whole account is like this ever-increasing closeness between his people and Jesus. He starts on the mountain, he comes down, he comes into the storm. Peter starts walking towards him. But there's still, Jesus wants Peter to be closer. And you get the impression that perhaps Jesus is wanting to deal with some of this self-determination in Peter. Or at the very best, perhaps he recognizes that this just it's not sustainable, this way of living. Just kind of this determined, I'm just going to keep my eyes fixed and I'm going to block everything else out and just keep walking. And the inevitable kind of happens. Peter sees a wave. The wind starts to howl a bit louder and he starts to take his eyes off. And then he starts to sink down into the water. And Peter cries out, doesn't he? He says, Lord, save me. And it's almost like this process has reduced Peter to the most, all of that self-will and self-determination that he's got. I'm just going to keep myself fixed. It hasn't worked. He can't sustain it. He can't do it. Reality has taken over. And that self-will has kind of gone. Yeah? And he cries out the most basic, humble prayer, I suppose, Lord, save me. Lord, save me. It's not just a kind of somebody save me. There's still faith in Peter. He knows that it's got to be the Lord that saves him because he's the only one that's not affected by this storm. He's not going down. And he cries out to the Lord, Lord, save me. And immediately, Jesus is there for him, right there. And he grabs Peter's hand, and Peter's probably clinging on for dear life to Jesus as Jesus kind of hauls him up out of the water. And it's amazing that Peter, he needed to have some of this determination taken down because it just wasn't sustainable. It had to be the Lord. The Lord had to save him and pull him up. It had to be the Lord's power enabling him to do this. And my imagination takes over a little bit after this point because it's not actually written. And I think I may have shared this before, but I kind of imagine that there's this point, after this where Jesus has reached out and saved Peter. The next bit says when they got back in the boat. And my imagination kind of says, well, something must have happened between that point because, they're on the water in this point and then they're back in the boat at this point. Somehow they got back into the boat. And so, there's only a few options as far as I see it. They either kind of miraculously just appeared back in the boat out of the water, bearing in mind the storm is going on still at this stage. Perhaps, and this is the least likely, I think, perhaps Jesus, who is, stood on the water and the waves, unaffected by it, is kind of holding on to Peter and is just kind of dragging this weight through the water and kind of hauling him back into the boat at the other end. It doesn't quite fit with the whole nature, the whole account. And I think the most likely, again, this is just my imagination, is that Jesus hauls Peter up out of the water and then together, probably arm in arm, at the very least hand in hand, some kind of connection between them, together they walked by his power, Jesus' power, back to the boat with the wind and the waves roaring around them. And I just thought, that's a very different place to the one Peter was in a minute ago with this, I'm just going to keep my eyes fixed. I'm just going to block everything else out. I can do this as long as I'm fixed. This is a different Peter. It's not a Peter that's self-determined or, got this great strength inside him. This is a desperate man who's humbly cried out to the Lord to be saved, has been saved, and is now back with Jesus walking over the waves. And because Jesus is untouched by the situation, that Peter can be as well. And the Lord's intention was to get Peter back to the boat, back to the safety of the boat. And it's an amazing picture, isn't it, of just what Jesus is able to enable us to do. And we've experienced that as a family over the last few weeks. That the Lord has been enabling us to do the impossible. but not because we've got this great strength of, I'm just going to keep everything else blocked out, no matter how strong these waves and this wind is. I'm just going to ignore it, okay? By his strength, he reached out and saved us and pulled us up, and is now, we're clinging for dear life to our Lord as he walks and by his power gets us safely to the boat. And it's really interesting that when Jesus gets back into the boat, so he's come from his mountain, he's seen his people struggling, he comes down the mountain, he comes into the storm, he kind of turns, he doesn't pass them by, he turns and engages with them, he enables Peter to do this thing, he reaches out and saves him at his very lowest point, he gets him back into the boat, and it's at that point when Jesus is in the boat, from the mountain into the boat, at the point when he's in the boat, that's when the storm ceases. That's when it says the wind and the waves stop. At that point, he's kind of demonstrated to his people who he is. He's demonstrated that he's the Lord, that he's the Lord of the wind and the waves, the circumstances, whatever it is, the internal battles, nature. He's the Lord of all of it. He's unaffected by it, and he's able to enable them to do the same, to walk over the things that should be causing them to drown. But when he gets into the boat, the storm ceases, the wind stops, and the waves stop, and there's just peace. And it's really interesting. This, there's a correlation between this and another account of Jesus calming a storm, which is in Matthew's Gospel, and I think it's in Matthew 8. I'm just going to check I've got this right. This is where Jesus is asleep in the boat, and there's a storm, and they all cry out to him, and he wakes up, and he just immediately says, "Peace, be still." And the storm just stops in a moment. And the way the people respond to him, I think, is really interesting. In Matthew 8, verse 27, so Jesus has effectively just stopped this circumstance. The storm is raging, and he's just come, and he's just said, "Stop," and it's calm, and he's just put an end to the difficult circumstance in their life. And the people, in verse 27, it says, the men marveled, or they were amazed, and they said, "What sort of man is this, that even the wind and the seas obey him?" So they're amazed, they're marveling at who this is, and they're asking a question: who is this? Who is this man? Who is this one who has authority over the wind and the waves? But then when you get into Matthew 14, they have a different response. When they've seen this time Jesus not just call an end immediately to the circumstances, but instead show himself walking over it and enabling a normal man to walk over it as well, and saving Peter from within it, it says, if I can find it, in verse 33 of Matthew 14, it says, "And those in the boat worshipped him, saying, 'Truly you are the Son of God.'" I just thought, isn't that amazing? When Jesus just came and stopped the circumstances, they say, this is amazing. Who is this? But when he doesn't just stop the circumstances, but enables, shows us that he's over it, he's in authority over it. It shows us that he can enable us to be over it as well, that we can cling on to him, that he can save us when we're sinking, that he can keep us above the wind and the waves. When people see that, when we see that, when others see that, it provokes a different response, doesn't it? It provokes worship, and it provokes a declaration. Truly, you are the Son of God. There's no more questions, is there? When we see him doing this in our lives, and we've heard testimonies of it this morning, and there's a testimony in my heart, despite the difficulty of some of the circumstances, truly, he is the Son of God. Truly, he can do things that no one else can do. He can still the storm, he can stop the circumstances, but he can enable us to walk over them and to walk through them by his strength. It provokes worship, and it provokes this declaration: truly you are the Son of God. So anyway, when Jesus is in the boat, the storm kind of ceases, and you kind of get the sense that once he's come in to the boat, perhaps that represents a life. Once he's come in, he's come down from the mountain, he's come into the storm, he's done this stuff with Peter. Once he's in the boat, it's almost like there's this complete shift and change in dynamic. Suddenly, he is the Lord of that situation. He's the Lord in that boat. He now is the captain. He's in authority inside the boat. And you get this bit in John's Gospel right at the end, which kind of just, for me anyway, just suggests that there is a completely new dynamic in this boat or in a life when Jesus is in it, when Jesus comes into a life. In verse 21 of John 6, it says, "Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going." I just thought, when I first read that, I was like, what? That's crazy. But, it's there, and it's there, I think, for a reason, because, the people, his disciples have been rowing as hard as they can to try and achieve the command that he gave them in the first place. I want you to get, that's the destination. That's where you need to go to. That's where we're heading. And they've tried their absolute best to obey that command, and everything's been against them. The circumstances have been against them. Perhaps their hearts have been against them. Their bodies have certainly been against them. They're exhausted at this stage. They clearly cannot achieve what he's asked them to do on their own. And then he's come down. He's come into the storm. He's engaged with them, saved them. He's come into the boat. He's taken authority. He's become the Lord. And now there's a complete change in dynamic, which I think is really interesting. Because if this was me, obviously there's no wind now, so they can't just put their sails up and just sail into their destination. I'd have been thinking, come on then, guys, let's pick up our oars again. Let's get rowing. We've still got work to do. There's a place we've got to get to. We're not finished yet. This is all amazing, but let's go. But instead, it says in John that the boat just immediately gets to the destination. You get the sense that there's a completely different dynamic at work now in their lives. Jesus is in authority in the boat, and he is going to get them to the destination. He will enable them to achieve the command that he initially gave them. We're heading out over there. That's where we're going. And I'm going to get you there. And I've just been really encouraged in our circumstances that these things aren't just nice kind of ideas, are they? The Lord, in one sense, he's done this for us on a great scale. He left heaven to come into the storm that is this world. Not just the storm of this world, but into our lives in the storm, in all of the mess and all of the struggle and all the difficulty. And, we know he is powerful and holy and exalted. And he could stop the storms, couldn't he? He could just still them. And sometimes he does. But sometimes he just allows them to continue in a way perhaps we don't understand. But he allows them, and he shows us that he's in authority over them. He shows us that he can enable us, with him, arm in arm, to walk over them. And he shows us that when he's in our boat, that he can get us to where he wants us to be without this. It's not that the Christian life is without effort. We know that's not true, but it's not this kind of effort that they were doing before. It's not the soul-destroying, we're getting nowhere kind of effort. This is something different. It's a different dynamic. It's a life where Jesus, it's his power at work. It's his authority, and he will get us to where he wants us to be. And so I just, it's encouraged me that that's what the Lord's doing in our trial at the moment, the storm that's going on in our life. He's saved us. He's lifted us up. He's got us into safety, and he will bring us through to the place he wants us to be.